So the Aurelia CLI makes unit testing quite easy. By default, we're going to get set up with the Jasmine test framework and the Karma test runner. So what I'm going to do is use the to-do application as a sample project here because I think we all understand it pretty well. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new project, and I will do it in this to-do folder, which is currently empty. We'll just go with the default, so require.js, building for the web platform, Babel transpiler, because we're doing ES6. We'll just use no markup processing here, no CSS Sass. We would like to, in this case, configure unit testing. So you can see here that the default is to configure the app with Jasmine and Karma. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm using Sublime, but you can use whatever you'd like. And yeah, we're going to create this project. And of course, in the background, you can see everything populating. Then finally, we'll go ahead and install all of our project dependencies. So now that we're all set up, I'm going to hop on over to our application code base. We can see that we have a Karma configuration file. Additionally, we can see we have this test directory, and within our test directory, we have this unit test folder. I'm just going to quickly head over to our app.spec.js file. And we can see that we have a really simple Jasmine test case here that's describing the app. And it's saying that the app should say hello. And when we create a new app, we would expect that the message would be hello world. And the reason we would do this, if I open my source folder and open my app component, which is the app.html and app.js, yeah, when we create a new project, we've got this h1 header element with a message, and our message is by default hello world. Let's just quickly go to the command line and start up our application. So we'll do au run with the watch flag. And if I go to my web browser and go to localhost 9000, we can see, yes, we do indeed have hello world. So we would expect that our test case would work. Well, the way we actually run these unit tests is in our command line. We'll say au test, and this is just using the test feature of the CLI. And if I run that, well, what it's going to do is it's going to quickly build the application and will actually load up a version of the browser, and it shows us that it executed the one test successfully and it's finished. So we're happy with that. Of course, we want to create our to-do application. So let's say we've come up with some sort of mock-up or some sort of plan, and I'm just going to pull up something very quickly I did here. We are going to want the header text to say welcome Nick. Perhaps we are going to create a to-do list custom element here, and that'll kind of be one sort of component here. And then maybe we'll have a to-do form, a custom element that will go below that to-do list. And this is kind of how we are going to put our application together. So what I'd first like to do is just very simply, let's change our existing test case to make sure that this header says welcome Nick with the exclamation point. I'll go back to our code. I'll go to the app.spec.js. To describe our app, we can say, well, it says welcome to Nick. And yeah, this is a very specific case, but we're just gonna be very simple right now. So we'd want it to say welcome Nick. Save that, and let's go back to our command line and run our test. And as I'm sure you might expect, this is not going to work at all because we haven't changed our application. And so this is a bit of a, and you can see here that we see that we failed our test, and here it says you expected hello world to be welcome Nick, and so it's not that, so we failed. And this is a bit of a kind of a test-driven development approach where I am going to kind of expect things that don't actually exist in our application, see them fail, and once they fail, that'll trigger me to say, okay, I need to do a little development work, and we will fix it up and then run the test successfully. So now that I've seen that it fails, I'm going to go back to my app.js view model and say, okay, this .message should actually be welcome Nick. I'll go back to my command line, and we can type au test again. And by the way, AU tests can also take a watch flag. And why that's kind of cool is we don't necessarily want to come back here and keep typing AU test every time we want to run our test. So we can just use that watch flag and be satisfied that whenever we come back, this will actually stay open. Whenever we come back to our command line, we can see it refreshed with the new test. So that'll be cool. I'll leave that running. So this is great. So the next thing we might want to do is, if I bring up our little schematic here, we might want to actually start creating this task list here. So how are we going to test that? Well, let's go ahead, and so it's not going to be within this app.spec.js. Let's create another unit test here, and perhaps I'll call that our, since we called it the to-do list, we'll call it to-do list.spec.js. And this is going to be a little different because if we go back to our app.spec, well, what we're doing is we're checking the property of the app, but perhaps we want to actually stage a component and put our custom element that we're going to create in that component. So fortunately, the Aurelia testing module lets you actually stage components. So we can import stage component from Aurelia testing. We also will want to import the bootstrapper for our application. So it's basically like we're actually bootstrapping the application. Okay, and so what we're going to do is, much like with our application here, we'll want to describe to-do list. And what we're going to want to do is, first, we're going to say that we're going to need a component. And ultimately, this is going to be the component in which we stage our to-do list custom element. What we're going to want to do is, just for testing purposes, let's just create a few kind of fake to-do list items. So we'll say let to-dos equal, and this will just be an array of objects. And way back in the beginning of this series, we dealt with these a little bit. So each one will have a title, and I'll just make it simple, item 1, and it'll have a completion status or a done, and we can just say false. And I'll make a couple more of those. Item 2, item 3, and perhaps the last one is actually completed. Cool. So we've created that. So what we want to actually do now is we are going to, before we run any tests, and before we run each test, I should say, we are going to want to stage a component, then use our to-do list element as a resource within that component. Then we want to put our to-do list in the view, and then we'll want to bind these to-dos to our to-do list. And that might sound like a lot to begin with, but I think when I write this code out, it's gonna make a lot of sense to you. So we'll say before each, and this is before each test that we run, we are going to want to say our component equals stage component. So we're staging a component. We are going to say with resources, and what we're going to use is our resources elements and to-do list. And this doesn't exist yet, but again, we're going to make a custom element called to-do list that'll serve the purpose of, if I bring my diagram up, it's going to serve the purpose of being this to-do list here. And we'll say that in the view of the component that we're staging, we are going to want to actually put that to-do list, and we are going to do to-dos.bind equal to-dos, and that'll be our to-do list component. And this should look very familiar to you. This is just literally if we had a component or our app component that we will actually have eventually, this is going to be the resource that we actually included in it. So finally, what we're going to want to do is say bound to, and we'll want to make sure that to-dos, we can bind to-dos to to-dos, or of course we can use our shorthand here and just say, okay, binder to-dos. And so before we run any of the tests within this specification, we are going to want to make sure that we have this staged component and that we include our to-do list element, our custom element, and want to make sure that that element is put in the view for this component and that we include these to-dos. Okay, and then one thing we're going to want to make sure to do as well is that after each test, we are simply going to want to dispose of the component, so we can just type component.dispose. Okay, great. So let's write our first test here. Our first test will be that we want to make sure that we see the to-dos that we expect to see. So we would, again, expect that perhaps whatever's holding task 1, task 2, task 3, whatever our HTML element is, we want the inner HTML of that element to, read task 1, task 2, or task 3. So we can say it should render the to-dos. That can be our first test case. So the first thing we're going to want to do is make sure that we bootstrap our component. So let's do component create and bootstrap. And then, okay, so now we can actually start accessing information on the DOM. So we can say the list elements equals to document.querySelector all, and you're used to this, I'm sure. And let's just say, if I pull up my diagram again, that each of these task 1, task 2, task 3, they're going to exist within a class called item. So great. Now we have access to our list elements. So what we're going to want to expect is, for example, our first list element is going to equal the inner HTML, that is going to equal item 1. So we can say expect list elements, and the first one is an index 0. We can expect the inner HTML to be item 1. And again, we can say this with some certainty because as we've staged this component, we've kind of seeded the to-dos and we know exactly what they are. So we're gonna expect that, and then we'll say, okay, we're done. So we'll also want to catch any errors when this happens so that we can report back to the user if this test doesn't go as planned. And we can console log the error, but we'll also want to say we want the string value of that error. So if I go back to the command line, yeah, of course our testing has failed because we don't even have a to-do list custom element. What I'm going to do on the right side here is just say AU generate, and it's going to be an element, and it'll be the to-do list element. Okay, great. So we still have an error within our AU test that's being watched on the left side, but it's a little different actually this time, and we can see within our log that the error is that we cannot read property inner HTML of undefined. Okay, so that's good. That means that we have access to this custom element, but there's no inner HTML of our list elements here because there's no such thing as a class with .item. So we're getting a little closer here. So if we go to our source folder and our resources, let's just go ahead and open up our elements, and we'll have our to-do list view and view model here. And instead of H1, let's just use UL, our unordered list. And for now, we can just say list item. Maybe we'll say class equals item. And of course, we can use our repeater. So we can say repeat.for equals to-do of to-dos. And within this list item here, we're going to just say this is going to be our to-do dot title. And of course, to make that work within our view model, we're going to have to make sure what's bindable here is the to-dos. Okay, great. So now if we go back to check out our tests, so we can see that we've executed 2 of 2 successfully. And in fact, if I go to my application, what I'm going to actually do is build out my app.html and my app.js to similarly also show some to-dos. So I'm going to require from resources elements to-do list. And then here we can actually use our to-do list. And of course, we're going to want to use todos.bind, and that'll be to-dos. And within our view model, we'll quickly want to just set some fake to-dos here. We can say this dot to-dos equals, again, an array, but maybe this will be a more realistic list of to-dos. So we'll say title equals clean room. Done is false. And we'll add a couple others. So we'll say walk the dog. And the final one will be test application. And so maybe walk the dog is done. Okay. Oop, this should be to-dos. Okay, so if we go back to our command line and we watch our application again, let's go ahead and go to our browser. So that's exactly what we'd expect to see, and our test case is acting as we'd expect. So everything's passing right now. That's great, but that's of course only part of what we want here. We also want to kind of, if I go back to my my mockup here, I can see that, well, we want these checkboxes. We want this delete button here, and when we do our check, well, we want this input to be checked, and we want the item to have a strike through. So yeah, we still have a little bit more to do within this unit test here. So let's go back to our application, and I'll close our app up, and I'm going to go back to our to-do list spec. And what I'll do is I'm just going to copy this test here, and we'll create a new test. So we can say that it should, I don't know, let's say it should check boxes for completed to-dos. So that's something that we know that it should definitely do. What we can do is edit this a little bit. So maybe we'll have checkboxes, and we can use any sort of query selector here. So I'll just say, just kind of out of laziness, I'll just say we have no other inputs on this page, so, or rather within this this custom element. So let's just use the inputs here. And so what we'd expect is, if we look back here, we'd expect item 3. We'd expect, since that's done, we'd expect a strike through, or rather we would expect the checkbox for that to be complete or checked. So checkbox 2 dot checked, we'd expect that to be true. Again, our third checkbox, which is at index 2, we're expecting its checked value to be true. So if we go back to our test that's being watched, so we have an error here that our third test failed. And well, yeah, we don't actually have any checkboxes, so now we have to go back and say, well, within our to-do list.html here, maybe we'll add some checkboxes. Okay, let's do that. And it'll be within this list item, within this repeater. So we'll say input type equals checkbox. And okay, so we know that checked.bind should be bound to the value of to-do.done. Okay, this is great. And I will save that. And we'll go back to our test that's being watched. And oh, okay, so we have another issue here now. So our to-do list should render the to-dos is now failing. Well, we know that when we check for class item, well, we only wanted the title. And so this is kind of important as you're building out your tests here. This is going to end up making your code a little cleaner and a little more readable, probably, in that you're going to want to make sure that you're kind of isolating everything that you want to test within its own selector. I think it just makes everything look a little nicer. So perhaps we'll have a span here. And yeah, maybe we can use span, and we'll say class is item text. So now we can go back to our to-do list spec, and rather than just saying item, we can say item text, give that a save, and we'll go back to our tests that are being run, and I can scroll all the way down and see, okay, great. So everything is running successfully now. And in fact, since I'm watching my application, I can even visually verify that if I go to my app, and we can see, okay, yeah, the second item is checked. So yeah, I can be pretty confident that if it says done, then it will be checked, which is great. So perhaps I'll do just one more test. So we'll say that I'm going to go back to my mockup here. Well, we're also going to want to verify that there's a strike through on the task that is complete. So let's go ahead and just kind of once again say use the same sort of construct here and say should put a line through completed to-dos. And so that's kind of pretty easy to understand. And so this time we can kind of take the same selector as we've done up here, and we can say that we want to get all of the item texts. And what we'd expect though is that for the second list item or list elements, we would expect that the style dot text decoration is going to be line through. Okay, so once again, our third item is completed, so there should be a line through the text. So I'll save that. We'll go back to our test being watched, and it says expected empty string to be line through. And of course there's no line through yet because we haven't created that line through. So now that we have a failing test here, we can go back over our to-do list HTML, and we'll use our little CSS property here of our span. And what we can say is that text decoration, and what this will equal to, we can use kind of a ternary operator here to say that to-do.done. So if that's actually done, what we'll want to do is line through. And if it's not done, what we can do is say none. Great. And just for readability, I'm going to put that on another line. I'll give this a save. And we'll go over to our application and say, oh, okay, great. This looks exactly how we want it to look. It's putting a line through everything, so our test should pass, correct? So I go back, and we still have one failing here. So what's going on? Well, it's not actually the last one that's failing, but actually since I put those line breaks and the spacing within my HTML, within my view, well, we're getting this not exact match here to be to show. So what we can easily do to kind of take care of that is if I go back up to saying it should render the to-dos, well, we could always just use a trim on the inner HTML. So I'll give that a save, go back to our tests, and yeah, executed 4 of 4. Great. So I've taken you through a little bit here to start building out the first part of our to-do list application, and we can see how we can use kind of test-driven development principles to kind of build out our tests. And if I pull up my mock-up here, we're getting pretty close to this application, but of course now we're also concurrently developing testing. Thanks for playing along as we explore unit testing in Aurelia. It's super easy with the CLI, and tune in next time and we'll talk a little bit about doing end-to-end testing to test really rather from a not from a component by component perspective, but our end-to-end kind of gets into testing how a user might actually see the application, and we'll start talking about, you know, walking through some common user stories for the application.